welcome. I'm delighted to see so many participants here this afternoon. As we were just checking there, perhaps you would, other than our speakers, if you wouldn't mind staying on mute, and please feel free to either leave your cameras on or off, whatever you prefer. But obviously we will be looking for some feedback, indeed some contributions later on, and I'll come to that in just a moment. Perhaps I might just start off very quickly and say that my own role in this session has changed somewhat. Originally, it was intended that I would give a presentation myself, but last week I was asked instead to chair the session. So in the interests of transparency and all, I should declare here that my regulatory interest and mention that I work with the Irish regulator, the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. When the AVMSD is fully transposed in Ireland, the BAI will be part of a new media regulator, the Irish Media Commission, that will regulate on-demand audiovisual media services that are the subject of our conversation this afternoon. And that will be the first time indeed that they will be under a statutory regulator in Ireland. They had a self-regulatory system was in place up to this point in time. I suppose I'd also say that the BAI has had quite extensive input into the debate about the future regulation of such services. And I suppose really, I think the two principal strands which we see as being very central for regulation in this area, indeed it will be part of our conversation this afternoon. One is, looks at the ensuring compliance with certain standards and codes and rules, and where applicable indeed for content, but not just for content, but where applicable for commercial communications. And I think the second element concerns the way in which content on SVOD services can contribute to diversity and perhaps to a lesser extent plurality for audiences. And these for BAI would be two very key objectives, if you like, particularly having regard to cultural and linguistic diversity for Irish audiences, so that they can have access to content that is culturally and linguistically relevant and which reflects Irish life, Irish identity, our own heritage, and indeed our public experiences. Obviously, the other element I think, which is very often a focus for regulation, is indeed the sustainability of our indigenous players, broadcasters, and independent producers. And I suppose we see this as being key to ensuring that that kind of content continues to be delivered for audiences. So I think that will be an ongoing focus of public policy in Ireland, and inevitably, I think, a key strategic objective for our new Irish media regulator. With the development of the Article 13.2 scheme as well, an urgent priority, very likely. Again, just very briefly, the SVOD market in Ireland is long and well established since around the 2010 period, and as recently as this year is seeing continued growth in streaming services. Netflix is by far the biggest player in Ireland, but Apple TV, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime, all are very active in the market as well. And indeed, impacts, I suppose, on our traditional viewing. 36% of all Irish adults no longer see the value in paying for TV plans, for live TV plans. Indeed, those percentages get much higher when it comes to millennials and Gen Z age demographics. So I think all of these trends, I think, indicate that people are both enjoying the type of content that SVOD services have to offer, and also I think the way in which these services can be consumed. But combined with the reduction in revenue sources for traditional media players, I think it highlights the cultural challenge facing regulators, notwithstanding the provisions of the directive that are aimed at supporting our cultural ambition. However, I'm going to leave it at that. I think all of these issues I'm certain will come into play in our conversation this afternoon. And I'd like to move on now to our presenters. But before I do so, maybe just a couple of practical points. There's been a small change in the order of our presentation to that which was originally circulated. I'm intending that Maya Capello will speak in the first instance, and then all of our other speakers will follow in the same sequence as would have been flagged in the original agenda. I would also like to point out that the focus of this session is on Svod, audiovisual media services, and not on video sharing platforms as such. I'd like to I think we have it seems around I'm thinking around 27 participants this afternoon, so hopefully that will lead to a lively conversation. Please feel free to put any questions or indeed comments or observations you might like to make. Please feel free to put those in the chat. I hope that when we have finished our presentations that we can take up some of your comments and questions and put those to our panelists this afternoon. Each participant, each of our presenters rather, will have about 12 minutes approximately for each presentation, and we hope to obviously conclude just before 5 p.m. In order to return to our final plenary session of the day. So first up, I'd like to introduce Dr. Maya Capello. I think she probably needs very little introduction for most of you. She's the head of the Department for Legal Information with European Audiovisual Observatory. She's been with the Observatory since 2014, and prior to that, she worked indeed in audiovisual regulation with the Italian regulator AGCOM. I won't even attempt to summarize her body of work, but just to say that she has published extensively on a wide range of audiovisual, legal, regulatory and policy matters. And today, Maya will provide a general context for our thematic session on Svod media services and the promotion of European culture. And I think she will pose some interesting questions that we'll take up when it comes to our discussions later. Maya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Celine, for this very kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Nice to be with a group of friends. It's a very intimate session we have, and that's great. So I will not feel ashamed if I don't manage to share my screen immediately. Let me see. I have to first put it on. This is a bit tricky. Alt Tab now. Do you see something now?
You might just give it one moment, Maya. Can't see anything yet. Do you want to try again?
Oh, you don't see it?
Nothing
okay.
So far.
Okay, then I try again. Very sorry for this. Like this. Do you see full screen?
Yes, it's fine. It's not full screen. If you could go full screen, that would be great.
Yeah, then I have to start again. Oh, this is horrible. I hate this. That's when you do the test and then it doesn't work. So now, like this. Does it work?
Yes, that's perfect, Maya.
Super. Thank you. I'm sorry for this. So indeed, as Celine said, I will try to set a bit the context for our thematic session. And I would like to start with a quote. I declare the global social space we are building to be naturally independent of the tyrannies you seek to impose on us. You have no moral right to rule us, nor do you possess any methods of enforcement we have true reason to fear. Well, these words probably make you think of Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, don't they? And yet, nothing further from the truth. The sentences I just quoted are part of a declaration of the independence of cyberspace, written by cyber libertarian John Perry Barlow on 8 February 1996. Those were the good old times where many, if not most, people believed that the internet should be an open, unregulated space. We're talking about the mid-90s, and that is the infancy of the internet, the good old times without YouTube, Facebook, or smartphones, a world without big data or fake news. And now in 2021, we have come to understand that there is not such a thing as an independent cyberspace. There are very good reasons for regulating the internet, and governments do possess methods of enforcement that actually work, more or less. So the question today is not whether we should regulate the internet, but how to do it, to which extent it should be regulated, and which methods of enforcement should be applied. Regulation is a means to an end. I think we will all agree on this. Some may even argue that it is just a necessary evil and it must be used as little as possible. Think, for example, of one of the most fundamental freedoms of all, the freedom of expression and information. Even in 2021, the idea of regulating speech may be alien to many citizens of democratic countries. Isn't speech by nature free? Obviously, it's not that simple. Like any other freedom, speech carries with it duties and responsibilities, and therefore may be subject to legal restrictions. The question is, who is in charge of imposing and policing such restrictions? And let's not forget that regulating is, or should be at least, the delicate art of balancing interests. We heard this already during the plenary session. Freedom to conduct business on one side of balance and consumer protection on the other. Freedom of expression on one side and protection of other rights on the other. It's a delicate and complex art. Now, the title of this thematic session is Society, Culture, Environment, SVOD Platforms. That is subscription based on demand audiovisual services such as Amazon Prime, Disney Plus, or Netflix, just to recap the basics. And I just mentioned the good old times without YouTube, Facebook, or smartphones. But actually, in the 90s, from the regulatory point of view, the internet also included on demand services. Broadcasting, that is linear services, was covered by the Television Without Frontiers Directive, and non-linear services such as video on demand, they were at the time falling under the scope of the e-commerce and the InfoSoc directives. VOD services represent the latest revolution in the audiovisual sector. They have changed the way we watch content at home and on the move. They have also brought great changes to the production of audiovisual works. And given their increasingly important position on the market, they have also an equally increasing power in deciding which works are accessible to European audiences. Now, paraphrasing Spider Man, one could say that with great power comes great responsibility. And that is probably what the EU thought when it introduced obligations for VOD services to promote European works in their catalogues. This was in 2007, when non-linear services were brought into the scope to the Television Without Frontiers Directive, renamed Audiovisual Media Services Directive, exactly to underline this fundamental regulatory change. From being providers of an InfoSoc service falling under an ex post liability for removal upon notice, on demand services were now covered by an ex ante editorial responsibility, exactly as broadcasting services, but with a smaller set of obligations. At the time, the obligations were rather light, since VOD services were in their infancy. Now they are quite grown up and received more serious rules from the EU in 2018. So let me explain you the rules in a nutshell. We all know them, but sometimes it's good with a recap. So first of all, why regulate the promotion of European works at all? Well, remember what I said before. Regulating is the delicate art of balancing interests. In the case at hand, the EU considered it necessary to promote markets of sufficient size for television productions in the member states to recover necessary investments, not only by establishing common rules opening up national markets, but also by envisaging quotas for European productions. You see them on the screen, more than 50% of the broadcasting time to be devoted to European works, that's the Article 16, and 10% of broadcasting time, or alternatively 10% of the broadcasting budget, dedicated to independent European producers, Article 17. And these obligations apply to TV services since then, and they have remained unchanged since they first were introduced in 1989. Now, with regard to VOD services, the 2010 version of the AVMSD foresaw a minimum level of regulation. Member states had to ensure that on-demand services falling under their jurisdiction promote, where practicable and by appropriate means, the production and access of European works. Such promotion could consist, first of all, in financial contributions to the production and rights acquisitions of European works. Secondly, in a minimum share of European works in the catalog of programs offered by the VOD service. And thirdly, in ensuring their prominence in the catalog. Importantly, these three options were on an alternative basis. And actually, at the time, recital 69 of the AVMSD explained, and I quote, that on demand audiovisual media services have the potential to partially replace television broadcasting. Accordingly, they should, where practicable, promote the production and distribution of European works and thus contribute actively to the promotion of cultural diversity. In 2018, things had drastically evolved. We saw that on one of the graphs I showed on the timeline of the evolution of VOD services. VOD services have in the meantime taken the market position we all know. So the EU introduced in the revised AVMSD a more serious set of obligations for VOD services. Quota and prominence obligations became both mandatory and cumulative in Article 13.1, in the sense that VOD providers are required to devote at least 30% of their catalogs to European works and also to give visibility to them. And financing obligations remained optional in Article 13.2, but where introduced, they could also be imposed on targeting services. For this latter case, Article 13.3 sets up a calculation system based on the revenues earned in the targeted member states, but if also the country of establishment imposes financial contributions, it shall take into account any financial contributions imposed also by the targeted member states. Now, if we had to summarize in 2 words the rationale for imposing these obligations on broadcasters and VOD services, these words could be cultural diversity. Maybe some of you might say, do we really have a problem with cultural diversity? I'm old enough to remember the times when TV channels in a given country could be counted on the fingers of one hand and newspapers were called papers for a reason. Nowadays, there are scores and scores of TV channels, and any newspaper on the globe is one click away. So, what is the problem? Well, precisely because the information offering is so overwhelmingly broad, people look for filters. And video on demand services can carry out this personalization for any user based on his or her personal viewing history or other preferences. But this has a downside: filter bubbles. The so-called filter bubbles that occur when algorithms filter in only what the user may be interested in, according to the algorithm, leaving out anything else. For example, if I like romantic comedies, the algorithm may recommend more romantic comedies to me and less spy movies, or vice versa. With the consequence that, ironically, more diversity of content could lead to less common experiences at society level, not at individual level maybe, but at society level, and effectively a less diverse cultural experience for each user. Now, talking about cultural diversity, you may have read an article in The Economist with this suggestive title, How Netflix is Creating a Common European Culture. In this article, the author argues that, and I quote, an irony of European integration is that it is often American companies that facilitate it, and gives the example of Netflix pumping the same content into homes across a continent, making culture a cross-border endeavor. The author then concludes, if Europeans are to share a currency, bail each other out in times of financial need, and share vaccines in a pandemic, then they need to have something in common, even if it is just binging on the same series. Indeed, Netflix, and I'm sure Marianna will be able to tell us more, has succeeded in making European works circulate across the EU probably like no one had made before. Think of successful Spanish series La Casa di Papel, in English Money Heist, in Italian La Casa di Carta. And it can be argued that this series would not have had the same reach across borders without the global platform provided by Netflix. But let's not forget, however, that Netflix's border crossing content does not necessarily originate in the EU. A recent example of this is the South Korean series Squid Game. Exactly as in the case of La Casa de Papel, it can be argued that Squid Game would not have had the same reach across borders without the global platform provided by Netflix. Does Netflix care about cultural diversity in Europe? Or simply, does Netflix care only about what is good for Netflix? Or said otherwise, do we need cultural diversity from wherever it comes? Or do we need more European culture? Do all these questions require regulatory action? To be discussed. But before I finish, one word about European culture. And again, a newspaper. You might have read an article in The Guardian in which they said that the EU is preparing to act against the disproportionate amount of British television and film content shown in Europe in the wake of Brexit, in a blow to the UK entertainment industry and the country's soft power abroad. Now, the thing is that with the current AVMSD regime, UK works are European works. And this is because the UK has left, yes, the EU, but remains party to the European Convention on Transfrontier Television. And the definition laid down in the AVMSD includes works originating in states party to the convention. Having said this, if the EU member states wanted to change those rules, they can, of course, but the procedure to change those rules is lengthy and complicated. And changing the rules would also have to be done in a general way. That is, it would affect not only UK works, but also other European works from non-EU member states that have ratified the convention. So the question could be, does the EU want to continue promoting European culture or just EU culture? I leave it with that thought and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maya. I think I promised that you might be posing some interesting questions, which I'm looking forward to taking up in our discussion. But just for the moment, I think we will proceed with our presentations this afternoon. And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to Andrea Macconi and Barbara Thomas. Andrea Macconi is Associate Professor in the Department of Media Arts and Communication in the IULM University in Milano. Professor Dr. Barbara Thomas is Senior Research with the Leibniz Institute for Media Research, Hans-Bredau Institute in Germany. They're going to share in a joint presentation this afternoon. They're going to share their experience and research in the UMAPLAT project, which at its central aim really is looking to analyze the role of media platforms in fostering or indeed dismantling European identity, and in examining its both its positives and positive and negative externalities. And I think the main research question posed, as I understand it, is whether or not new platforms, and I think in this context we are talking, of course, about Svod services, are making European culture more European or not. You're both very welcome, and I'll hand over to you now for the presentation. The floor is yours. I believe, Andrea, you will be the first to speak, if I'm correct.
Thank you, Celine, also for the presentation, which was perfect, I have to say. I will try to share my screen and hope for the best. Can you see something?
That's perfect. If you can go full screen, Andrea, even better.
Full screen is like that?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting us. I will provide the sort of general description of the UMAPLAT project, and then Barbara Thomas, who is one of our leading researchers in the project, will say something more about the regulation side of the general media platform issue. I have to say, I will quote what Maya Capello was saying. This is a perfect definition of our goals. What Europe is about, cultural diversity or a common European culture, which is the first question. And the second one is to which extent this cultural common life has to be regulated. We are talking about one Europe, many Europe. We are talking about a top-down process, the regulation side, or we also have to look for some kind of Europeanization processes from below, as top-down processes, which can result, for instance, from some specific audience practices, because this project is about media. So the idea is exactly to try to understand whether or not what we call platformization, which means the last stage in the evolution of media systems towards what we define, very broadly speaking, platforms are making European culture more European. That is exactly the goal, with a focus on, I have to say, we are trying and we'd like to put an emphasis on the positive externalities, because everybody is, I'm a critical sociologist, by the way. I spent my life teaching critical ideas about the web, about some quite naive interpretations of digital democracy, but this is something we already know. So we are more interested in some positive externalities. For instance, is Netflix really making a new European common culture? These may well be, but in Work Package 3, we'll try to measure this by considering what people are properly watching in different European countries. Okay, this is us. We are a network of 12 partners in 10 countries, all in the EU, with a relevant exception, which is the Bilkent University in Ankara. And I'm very proud of this, because obviously this is bringing many complications related to, well, you know, that data transfer to non-EU countries, which is really complicated. But on the other hand, and is giving us the opportunity of studying a huge, broad media market we don't know basically anything about, which is very interesting to me. Okay, this is us. And I will start my short overview by going back to our friend and scientific advisor, Donald Sassoon, in his very, I'd say, paramount work on the history of European cultural industries in the last few centuries. And Sassoon's idea is exactly the fact that basically there is no such a thing as an European culture, which basically means that in all European countries, what people use to consume, to read, to listen to watch is mostly the local national culture and cultural contents imported from the US. This is the idea. So in terms of geocultural patterns, you have the local, the national, and you have the global, which is very often happens to be American cultural production, for instance, in the movie market, which is the most clear example you could find. So the point is, where is Europe between these two extremes of the local and the global? And to which extent platformization is changing the organization of European media systems in terms of production, distribution, and consumption. For this reason, this is Sassoon again, in a more recent book, the idea that what Europeans know is basically the United States, their movies and those coming from the US. I agree with Sassoon. This is the main problem to some extent, to find the place of European culture for European citizens. So we started with a sort of general, not general, analytical indeed, analysis of the last 30 years in terms of media production and distribution in all European countries in these cases, working by mostly adopting Mancini and Hallin's model, the so-called comparative media systems, with the goal of understanding how Europe, so to speak, how European media systems used to be with respect to TV, radio, newspapers, cinema, and all the galaxy of the so-called OTT, which I have to say, this session has mostly to do with video services and for pay services. We have some difficulties there because data related to all these OTT are very patchy. Very often the same object goes under different categories. So there's a lot of confusion among, I don't know, cable TV, pay TV, OTT, and this is quite complicated. In any case, I have to say, for our goal, the general argument of video services will split among different work packages. So we will have basically home video and video platform, video sharing platforms in work package 3. We have OTT and pay TV and traditional TV as well in work package 1. This is acceptable as it is questionable, but you have to find, I mean, a balance between endless things in this project, which is, I forgot to tell you, it's a 3-year classical Horizon project about evolving media landscapes and Europeanization. That was exactly the goal. So what we started to do, these are some exercises we are making, but I cannot release these results because work package 1 will come to an end in 3 months. What we are trying to do is exactly to look for, after collecting all data related to all those movie market categories, what we are trying to do is to look for, I don't like this word, which is really abused, but it's the only one I could find. We are exactly looking for patterns. When you study the distribution of, I don't know, private radio channel, the distribution of newspaper, to which extent people are used to consume pan-European cultural content, the idea is exactly to look for patterns in terms of any given variable and obviously in terms of correlation among those variables and media trends. The idea is exactly to try to understand how many Europes are there. We know that there is no one Europe. There are as many Europes as there are national states, which may well be an answer. In some cases, well, you know that some media markets work exactly in this way because, I don't know, in the case of comedies and obviously in the case of news, the media market is mostly national. With other respects, we are using the regional level, which is that going back to Mancini and Hallin's methodological framework, which means there are maybe 4 or 5 Europe, the Nordics, the center, the Mediterranean, and the East. And then once again, the more you dig into the data and the more you discover that there is no such a thing as the Eastern European system. There are perhaps 4, 5, 6 systems in Eastern Europe. What we are trying to do is to try to have a sort, not properly a data-driven, but to have a quantitative confirmation of these hypotheses. To which extent in media in Europe used to be European or global or local or regional or obviously global, which usually means American. Needless to say, we were discussing today in Athens the deliverable related to movie market, obviously at the very first level, at the highest level of the box office, you have American blockbuster. This is almost obvious. I will, before giving the floor to Barbara, I will just share with you, and then I will leave this to the discussion, what we do in the other work packages, which will cover these platformization processes with some parallel hypotheses. Work package 2 will be about journalism and discussion about public issues. So we will work in 10 countries by considering how people talk about the most relevant issues for Europeans in social media, in 4 social media platforms. And obviously we had to rely on the Eurobarometer, and the 4 main areas of interest will be obviously economic crisis and economic stability, environment, and and in the end, we also had to add the COVID-19 and obviously healthcare to this. And once again, the idea is trying to understand whether, I mean, similarities and differences, divergences and convergences among the different areas of the so-called European public sphere. Work Package 3, as I was saying, will be about the question already mentioned about the Economist article, Netflix is creating an European culture. We don't know yet. We will work on 4 video platforms, 3 in all countries, and the 4th one will be specific to each country. Because I have to say, yes, the Casa de Papel is an example. In my opinion, Scam is the most interesting example, but I have to say, we don't know yet if these are exceptions, which may well be, or there is a trend, which means that is now more common for, let's say, for Italians to watch, I don't know, Belgian movies, which was very rare at the movie theater. I don't know. We will try to collect as much data as possible for finding an answer here. In Work Package 4, we will deal with, let's say, inclusion, which means we'll work on 2 main priorities. These were priorities for the call, I have to say, which are gender and migration. And once again, we'll try to understand in which way this is not simply about the discussion, it's the representation of, which is more complicated, of gender and migration in the 10 countries, but perhaps in this case, we'll collect data also from UK and from France. So we'll have arguably 12 different countries. Final Work Package is the most creative one, which will be led by our friend Nico Carpenter, and we will try to draw both some theoretical conclusions as well as operational indications to policymakers, which means according to our data, research, and in our understanding, these are the main mistakes, these are the best practices we could find in the creation of a European common, let's say, media sphere or mediascape. You can pick the expression you prefer. So by and large, the idea is to provide an advanced assessment of how Europeans media market used to be. We are almost there in Work Package 1. And then try to understand how European they are becoming in as an effect and as a result of the platformization process. These, among many other things, obviously, it's a big project. So those are the information I would share with you, and I'll look forward to the discussion. Thanks. I will have to stop. Is that okay?
Thank you, Andrea. Yes. Thank you. I think we're seeing some really good common themes emerging here. I will keep it moving and pass over to Barbara, who I know is also going to continue her presentation on the UMAPLAT project.
Yes, thank you. And I hope it works. Yes, I try to be brief, and I think I can be brief because it fits interestingly enough with what Professor Damiani introduced, because as regulation and the Digital Service and Digital Market Act was in the focus of his presentation, I'm very happy here to contribute just some short ideas about regulation, which is, as you saw in our UMAPLAT project, just a very tiny small part of it. But I want to share here some ideas on this, which I want to put under the, let's say, headline of path dependency. So the logic that the way how media are regulated in general follows a logic which is in a continuation of regulation which has taken place with former media. When we just try to step back and look how we came from audiovisual media regulation to platform regulation, then I see as a starting point that all this issue of media regulation started in the EU with the liberalization and privatization of the audiovisual markets because of cable and satellite. And this showed as well some weaknesses in the European audiovisual production and distribution industries, which we had discussed as well. The response was then the Television Without Border Directive with all these programs that you know. And it is interesting enough that the idea of the information society in quotation marks came in only in 1994, where the internet was not yet managed. The internet as a word started only to appear in the EU documents with in 96, and then with the e-commerce directive, the InfoSoc directive, the first pillars of European platform law start. And in all this, the focus of what happened was the narrative of regaining European sovereignty. So this was very much in the focus, and the democratic purposes, how to look at public communication, which is mitigated by all these media, how this is fostering our democratic structure, was not explicitly in the focus. Just to remind you, what are then the milestones of media regulation? We can circle them around those regulations which are media specific, those regulations which are then digital network media specific. Also, this is going to the platform regulation and in this very general issue of data protection. Now, the context we have to keep in mind is that this is what I call path dependency. Media regulation has since long been broadcasting regulation, but with media convergence, and this meant the converging markets, converging actors, converging productions, and so forth. Another form of regulation was needed, but, and this I find very important still to keep in mind, whatever regulation, whatever media are regulated, we still have to think about media as a factor of stabilization or destabilization of social order. And this is what is now coming much more in the focus. Or let's say in another word, which Barbara Pfetsch named, that we now, when looking at public communication, we have to acknowledge that communication in digitized public spheres is dissonant public spheres, and there the whole problem derives from. Now, media regulation, I would say, and this takes up the idea of Maya saying that it is a delicate art of balancing the interest. It is the delicate art between democratic publics or even democratic values for the publics and competition policy. Now, when I look at the normative objectives, which are on the perspective of relevance to democracy, then of course it is ensuring this high qualitative integrative media offer, having more of a stakeholder governance and participation, as well the containment of the commercial context can be a normative object, the data security, the diversity, all these were these objects, and very strong now on the scene is the protection against hate, disinformation, and any other harm. The revision of the Audiovisual Media Service Directive, I don't have to go through, is very much already in this direction. And the central focus was there, how to fix the rules of conduct for online platforms. It tried already quite a lot, but this was not enough. And this is why the Digital Service Act and the Digital Market Act came into being. And I don't go through this slide because Professor Dambini explained it very well. Very shortly, I didn't have the time to elaborate the argumentation, but very shortly, from this very briefly running through this path that we went over the last 30 years, I would say that the regulation was never really offensive in the idea how to shape our mediascape. It was very much kept in the realm of competition regulation, as this is the ground on which the EU works. But therefore, there was sort of a lacking of the balancing with a strong orientation to democratic prerogatives. It was more about the competition issue. And of course, a strong effort to regain European sovereignty. And I think we will have to think further about the idea how to foster more this, what I call democratic prerogatives. And yes, I think we will have to look very closely at how this will go on. This was just very, very briefly, but some ideas on regulation, which I wanted to share and discuss with you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and your comments are very welcome. I think that, again, they feed into a theme perhaps that's emerging, and we'll come back to some of these issues later in our session. I'd like now to introduce you to sorry, I beg your pardon, just want to get my order of running here, to Elia Cornelia Marie. She is Assistant Professor in Communications with the Universidad Juárez Autónoma de Tabasco. I hope my pronunciation is good there, Elia. And she's joining us all the way from Mexico today. We're delighted to have her. She is going to be sharing the findings of her research on the practice of binge watching amongst university students. Elia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really a pleasure. I'm very glad to be here. I will try to share my screen now. And you have been talking about regulation at the macro level, let's say. So now I'm going to try to go to the micro level, which is audience study with college students here in Mexico, in the southern part of Mexico. So thank you very much for having me again. And what I will share with you are some benefits of VOD platforms that's as perceived by college students here in Mexico. This is my university, Universidad Juárez, which you pronounce perfectly. Thank you very much. And this is the agenda for my presentation. First, I will provide a context about VOD in Mexico, then a definition of binge watching and the reasons why to study it. Then I will talk a little bit about binge watching among college students and my research project. And finally, I will share with you the benefits as they are perceived by the students. So first of all, the market of VOD in Mexico is very competitive. It started early because Netflix arrived here in 2011, in October. And now there are many VOD providers. You can count all the big ones, Amazon Prime, and then also Apple TV Plus and Disney Plus, HBO Max, everything is here. And we also have some local providers like Blim from Televisa. Maybe you have heard about Televisa, and also from Claro Video, from the huge telco Telmex. We have here in Mexico, it is loosely regulated. Video on demand services are understood mainly as platforms, not as broadcasters. So there is a different regulation for broadcasters. And there are concerns about cultural influence, but they are not so high as I am listening they are in Europe. There was a recent initiative in April of this year to establish a 15% quota, and it did not prosper. So we can see that this is not really a concern. The VOD platforms started paying taxes just in June 2020. So also they were pretty much free to do whatever they wanted before. In this context, I wanted to study binge watching, which is a practice that is strongly linked to SVOD. It is not new because we can remember when we used to tape, the shows on VHS, but it saw a surge in popularity from 2013 on. And it is very linked to Netflix, to the point that it has been called the Netflix effect, because it was this platform that allowed for the technical features that make it a lot easier. We can remember this feature of post-play and also a skip intro, and also the idea of launching complete seasons. I just put a picture here of House of Cards because it is considered one of the first series that was launched internationally, and it was available the whole season. And this marked a point of departure for the availability of this kind of content. The definition of binge watching is not clear. It's not clear yet, but I like this definition I found of Merikivi and al, because they say that binge watching is viewing more than one episode of the same content in a single sitting with one's own pace and time. And this takes into consideration two factors: continuity and viewers' agency, or their capacity to do the schedule for your own content, the content you want to see at the moment. And this is very important because it implies a change in the way of approaching television content. I'm talking here about the practices of the platforms, how to use the platforms. I'm not focusing on content, I'm not focusing on the culture, or I'm not focusing on what they are seeing, but how they watch it or how we watch it. And the common idea of binge watching, as portrayed here in a picture from the Big Bang Theory, is it leads you to addiction, to the sedentary lifestyle, to sleep problems, and even isolation. And there are plenty of studies about this. You can go and search, and you will find many hundreds of studies about this. So it is very, very important at the moment. And so I embarked trying to know how this practice was for the students in my university. I decided to go with a mixed methods approach. So I am using both focus groups and also a survey, an online survey. And before starting my own research, I knew that they have found already that binge watching is used by college students always to relax and to socialize as well. So it is not only bad things, but also positive effects. What I found, the project was exploring possible effects of binge watching on well-being among college students. And the age in Mexico for college students is usually 18 to 25. I did 6 focus groups with 30 participants in total, both male and female, 15 and 15, from different disciplines. And then I complemented this by doing an online survey with 476 respondents. And this was a convenient sampling that I applied to the whole university, but only these people wanted to answer. And the results show that watching with full control, the idea of binge watching, agency, plus continuity, it was considered in general very positive. And it's also considered a given for this generation. They see as novel the idea of watching 1 episode per week, which is another practice that is being pushed by Disney Plus, for example, for the premium content. The main result from the focus groups is that they are very aware of both the dark side, but also the white side or brilliant side of the practice. And I was surprised to find that some of the participants offered testimonies of finding relief in VOD platforms after accidents, depression, stressful situations like the COVID-19 lockdown. They mentioned that they use it as a distraction after romantic breakups, stress relief, dealing with the school anxiety, and also a way of socializing. They use this platform that is called Rave to watch at the same time with their peers, the same content. And also they call it a refuge. And all of this was surprising to me because I was expecting more about the bad effects. I am sharing with you a couple of quotes from the research. They are in Spanish, but I will just highlight the idea. This was a guy that said that he had clinical depression, and then watching the series was making him feel much better. So he said that he uses them as some kind of antidepressants, which is, I think, very, very interesting. Also, another male student said that after a breakup, after an accident, he used the binge watching as a escape valve, which is also a way of perceiving how they see this possibility of entertaining themselves through these platforms. And finally, the results from the quantitative phase tell us that this is true for 63.4% of the people. Because when I found this in the focus groups, I wanted to see how prevalent it was. So what I did was asking a particular specific question, and I was surprised to see that it was 2/3 of the respondents saying that also for them it had been helpful after a difficult emotional period. And here we can include, of course, the lockdowns from the pandemics. Other perceived benefits were relaxation, time for one's own, sharing quality time with family, partners, and friends, learning useful things, knowing different cultures, like Korean, Turkish, for example, more than European as well. But I think anime, Turkish and Korean drama are the top now here for this generation. Also practicing languages, getting to know their own profession, all of this came in the focus groups. And I think this is evidence of the positive effects of a viewing practice that is enabled by VOD platforms, because they offer agency to viewers. I'm talking about the agency of changing, the content, of choosing what to watch, of maybe, I don't know, getting access to some content that somebody else recommended, all of this. And these students are also aware of the dark side of the binge watching, insomnia, eye strain, headaches, sedentary lifestyle. So they are not blinded to this, but they also recognize that it can be good. And I think in the future, it is useful to look at classifications of feast watching versus cringe watching that is proposed by Pittman and Steiner. And also to try to identify which are the practices, and not only using catch-all terms like binge watching itself, because Turner has already said that it is not correct. We are not really taking into consideration what is really happening. And I think that legislation should take into consideration specific audiences' opinions of what a practice means in their daily life. Thank you very much for your attention. These are my references. And I'm sorry for the noise, but I'm in a trip, and so I had to connect from a friend's place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aliyah. And I think this might be a good time to remind our participants in the session who may well have further questions relating to your research. If you have any comment you'd like to make indeed on Aliyah's presentation, or indeed any of the presentations, feel free to make a comment or to put a question in the chat function, and we'll take it up hopefully after our last speaker, who I'd now like to introduce. I'd like to warmly welcome Marianna Scharf, who is Director and of EU Public Policy with Netflix. In her role, Marianna focuses on entertainment and media policies, as you might expect, and she's the primary point of contact for the European institutions and stakeholders, other stakeholders on public policy matters. Prior to working with Netflix, Marianna worked for Facebook, where she focused on economic policy, and prior to that she had a role in EU Public Affairs Consulting. Marianna, you're very welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Aline, and hi, everyone. Very grateful to be here today. Thank you to the speakers for their great presentations. And of course, thanks to IIC and Agicom for organizing and bringing us together. It would have been nice to be in person, especially given the size of our group. I think it would have been a lively debate, but also very cozy. So I'm Marianna, covering EU policy for Netflix, based out of Brussels. And today's topic is important and timely. I'll kick off by making a short introductive comment about semantics, because as we all know, language and legal concepts are important. And then I'll highlight 3 key themes that we're seeing emerge. And I won't be using slides, which will save me from awkwardly failing to project them, which is definitely what would have happened to me if that had been the case. So just maybe as a short way of intro, we understand that today's overall theme of the event is dedicated to platforms, but we're also glad to see that this panel's title specifically mentions VOD services. And that's because platforms are defined in the EU legal order, which is where I'm from. And apologies for focusing on the EU here, but I understand it's similar in other regions of the world. And most recently, again, platforms have been defined, the DSA and the DMA, which several speakers have again mentioned today. And they've been defined as hosting services and intermediaries. And Netflix, as a streaming video on demand service, is a single-sided provider, and it neither hosts third-party content, nor does it intermediate. So our catalog is fully licensed or owned, fully curated. We have editorial control. And then finally, also as a final comment, I mean, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive itself, which I think everyone in this virtual room is very familiar with, makes itself a very clear distinction between on-demand audiovisual media services and video sharing platform services. And we think it's really important to point this out and focus on this as a second, especially as we're witnessing increasing convergence in the market with more and more both traditional but also new actors moving to streaming either via catch-up or fully fledged on-demand services. So the three themes I wish to touch upon today are number one, the cultural impact, number two, the economic footprint, and then maybe finish a bit by talking about inclusion and diversity. So kicking off with cultural impact, to clarify things from the get-go, our goal is not to build a common and unique European culture. Netflix's goal is to tell great stories from all over the world and to bring them to our members all over the world. And this means working with the very best creators and partners in order for them to be able to tell their story authentically. And so our content teams will give priority to local content that can be successful in a local market. And if content travels beyond its local market, that's fantastic. And we believe, that happens if we're able to offer the same production value audiences are used to. And also if we're able to offer really best-in-class, top-notch subtitling and dubbing. And so I think it's fair to say that we've been one of the first companies to really bet big on this, and that this has paid off. I wanted to mention Casa de Papel, which has been mentioned a couple of times today. So maybe, to mention Lupin from France, more recently, Castagne Manden from Denmark, which really proved that Europeans, but also global audiences are interested in experiencing other cultures. And given that we're virtually in Italy today, I just wanted to point out that tomorrow we have an Italian masterpiece of a film coming out, Stata la mano di Dio with Paolo Sorrentino, which I'm also sure will be appreciated by audiences globally, despite being a very local Neapolitan story. So it's not about creating a common European culture. It's allowing the rich national cultures and stories to cross borders. And it's very interesting that so many speakers on this panel are studying this, and we're very curious to see what comes out of their research. So my first point was about the demand that there is for European content locally, regionally, globally. And then my second point is how this translates into economic footprint and economic impact. So between 2018 and 2021, Netflix invested over 4 billion euros in European content. And this translated into over 35,000 cast and crew jobs, and it's translated also more crucially in over 1,000 European titles. And so we did this through a combination of licensing content, original productions, co-productions, working closely with producers, public service broadcasters, and commercial broadcasters across Europe. And more generally, and on an industry basis, what we're seeing is that the level of investment in European content is reaching unprecedented highs and creating unprecedented opportunities for European creators. And maybe also interestingly, what we've seen is that we've seen this level of investment happen organically since before the Audiovisual Media Services Directive became a reality. And so we see this happening organically because there is organic demand for European content. So my last point that I wanted to touch upon with you is about the impact that video on demand can have on contributing to a more inclusive and diverse world via storytelling. I mean, I don't have to explain the shift from linear to nonlinear. Obviously, in a nonlinear world, the consumer is right in the middle. I think people mentioned agency, choosing what to watch. And we believe one of our biggest impacts is contributing to create films, series, documentaries that can increase empathy and understanding for people from underrepresented communities. And whether that's gender, sexual orientation, color of one's skin, and at the same time for these people to experience what it means to see oneself on screen for the first time. To be able to tell these stories, we need to foster a new generation of storytellers, bring all the voices that have not been at the table so far, to be able to bring them to the table. And to do this, we have been, for the past couple of years, building a global initiative, but which is local, with local project called Grow Creative, with its mission being to dismantle access barriers. So several of these projects are being rolled out in Italy. I was looking at what we were doing in Italy, and to, maybe name two examples. We recently announced a collaboration with the Scuola di Cinema for their first Master in Scripted Development, where we will be funding several scholarships to increase access. And then we've also recently launched an initiative called Becoming Maestre, which is a project dedicated to training for female talent. And we've developed it hand in hand with the Accademia del Cinema Italiano. So we are very proud of the progress achieved in this specific field, but we realize we still have a long way to go, and we look forward to going further hand in hand with the rest of the industry. That's it on my side today, and hopefully we still have a bit of time for a conversation and some questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Marianna. I think it was absolutely essential that we had the views, the perspective from an Svod service. So thank you very much for participating today and for your insights, I think, in terms of how you're approaching your European objectives. Once again, I'll just remind our participants here that if any of you would have a comment to make or would like to pose a question to any of the panelists, we'd be happy to do that. But perhaps I might first of all just take up myself with one or two questions to our panel this afternoon. And I think in particular for me, what is always to the front of my own mind when we get to discuss this kind of common objective, European objective, is, is this whole idea of, is there a common European, is there a single European culture? Are we talking about an assembly of different national cultures or regional cultures within Europe? And I suppose the question that I'd like to pose, maybe Maya or indeed Andrea, you might have some views on this. Do you think we're clear enough about what our cultural objectives are in this regard, Marianna? And I think it's commonly understood that there's those two aspects of both an economic ambition and also a cultural ambition here. But I'm just wondering whether the definition we have is working, or do we need to really reframe, maybe rethink what is our objective here, with a view to what can be realistically achieved? I'll put that out there. I'm happy to take any responses that you might have.
Well, since you mentioned me, I can maybe give it a try also on the basis of the various mapping reports we have been working on lately. We worked on, for example, the concept of nationality, which is very much linked to what is European, because many catalogs, at least so far, until we have been more used to global players, they were basically made of national works. So the broadcasting time of national players were made mostly of national works, maybe of works of the most eager export-friendly countries. So Italy has always been a strong producer, so there was plenty of national content. Maybe not the same could be said at the time of the Baltic countries, who might not have been so rich at the time. Same for the Nordics. They have been very great in increasing their productions now. Now with the Scandi Noir is something that we watch everywhere. But in the 90s, certainly, and there I speak as Norwegian national, there was not that much that was being produced. So what was European was probably never perceived as something that was worth even watching because it was so distant. And even the European motto, United in Diversity, shows this very well. There is probably nothing that is European as an identity, but it is an umbrella concept where we are close to each other and can enjoy our content. Now that we are more used to export, and Marianna mentioned dubbing and subtitling, this is indeed a great gateway in order to make content accessible. Also to enjoy the original language, but at the same time, avoid the dubbing, which I personally never liked very much, even if the Italian school of dubbers, for example, is great, but you lose a lot of the color and the flavor. Now with the subtitling, the exportability of the works has been better, and also the share of non-national content in our catalogs is increasing. The observatory is collecting plenty of data on this, and that is a very interesting shift that we are witnessing. We have also, some of you mentioned co-productions, and I think that was also you, Marianna. And co-production is something that was more common in the cinema world, but now it's becoming more and more common also for TV series. And it's a way of joining forces, which has, of course, the side of the incentives. I mean, the more you co-produce, the better you're placed to get public funding, which is important in order to get the production up and running. And there, even to act as a minority co-producer can help bring smaller production countries in the picture. And this helps to bring in, to contribute to something that is European, let's say, when you have co-productions with 4 or 5 countries where some bring in the team, others the actors, the screenwriters, the directors, the different roles. Well, then we start having many building blocks where the result is certainly more European than we probably had 10, 15 years ago, where we had a few big producing countries, but with mainly national productions. So I think we are getting there, more and more European.
Well, good to know that those trends, and I think, you know, even based on anecdotal experience, I think is certainly that there's increased trends in some of these areas. But I think that idea that perhaps what European culture is about celebrating diversity might be a good starting point in terms of what you're saying. Andrea, would you like to come in on this point, please?
Well, I have to say, I have a different perspective because I'm a sociologist now, and therefore, I mean, regulators have a very specific goal. Market players have a very specific goal, which is making money. As a sociologist, I cannot take any side. I mean, we are studying some processes. Then, in the end, can be that we'll find some interesting examples of cross-European culture. That would be good. Can be that European culture turns out not to exist. Can be that people still prefer American contents. I mean, I will have to live with that. I know, obviously, that my funding institution, which is the European Commission, does care a lot about Europeanization. We know that. We'll have to find a balance, meaning that we have to put the research object in this perspective for sure, but without taking any side. I mean, that's the point. I think it's a very different perspective. We are not changing. Our work is not to change the state of the art, is to try to analyze as much as we can the state of the art. So I think this is not exactly my point.
Okay, that is fair enough. I think then the question, I suppose the one of the questions that we must ask ourselves is, you know, when will we know if we've achieved this objective? What are those performance indicators that will actually indicate to us that actually we're achieving? And it seems to me that perhaps that needs a wider discussion, perhaps than perhaps the basis upon which we make that assessment at the moment. Understanding at the same time that having targeted quotas can be helpful in trying to reach the objective, but maybe a more complex and a more detailed discussion might also be might also be helpful here. I believe our Commissioner, Elisa Gyomi, would like to ask a question. Elisa, you're very welcome to take the floor.
Thank you, Celine, but I believe that there was someone else who raised his hands before. Probably I saw Pia Mabrit Jensen. Is that correct? I saw a hand which was already raised and did not want to.
Thank you.
the queue.
Thank you for pointing that out. I believe we do have Pia here. Pia, would you like to take the floor, please?
Yeah, no, I actually made a comment now, but you know, it's like I've researched Danish drama and how it traveled into the world. I've researched how crime fiction travels around Europe. And now I'm researching young Danish kids, and they're like, what are they watching? And you know, like, I think Danish drama and some of the other stuff is there exceptions to the rule that people are overwhelmingly still watching US content on, and now also not on European broadcasters, but on US based platforms. Or I know they're based in Europe, but you know, coming out of US with very large catalogs of non-European content. And I'm not sure it's a problem for the individual child, but it is certainly maybe a problem for a country like Denmark with a small language and a high proficiency in English, where our kids from the age of 9, they switch to English language content. Yeah, so I'm just curious to hear perspectives on that, because I completely agree with the rise in co-production, that Netflix is doing a great job in many of their series and also in diversity and everything. But what about this other aspect?
Thank you. Thank you.
May I? Sorry, Pia, the link is not working.
What's not working?
The link to your paper.
Yes, I think I've just belatedly seen it in the chat.
Yeah, it's not working.
Oh, the link is not working. Pia, would you mind perhaps posting
I will
the
share
link
it.
again?
It's because our university has a security threat. I think that's why.
Okay. All right, I will send you an email and well, I'll get in touch. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Pia. And look, I think I can share some of the views expressed there as a small European nation ourselves, and where English is, in fact, the majority spoken language. And indeed, look, this is not to say that streaming services like Netflix don't produce some really high quality and very enjoyable content, which I'm sure many of us enjoy. But Marianna, perhaps I could just put one question to you. You know, and it's this issue, it's a debate that we sometimes have in Ireland, for example. Do you think that when we come to talk to broadcasters and smaller independent producers, they're very concerned about their scale versus the kind of scale that's involved in a Netflix project, and somehow don't necessarily see themselves as being very well positioned to balance out, if you like, the expectations perhaps that you might have in making, as I said, what is sometimes very, very high quality and very popular content. I'm just wondering, are there initiatives in the context of your European objectives and your European strategies? Do you think that there is potential perhaps to try and explore ways in which some of these local collaborations might be progressed? And I'm thinking, for example, with, you know, services that might have a particular, you know, might be linguistically specific, or services that might have a public service kind of dimension. Do you think there's room to really sit down and explore ways in which the overall sort of production environment at a national level or in regions of Europe might benefit from looking at ways in which Netflix can collaborate? Because I would have thought that in terms of achieving, you know, meeting your own obligations in terms of European content, this would be one very important way to go, and that is an area that needs further exploration.
Yeah, thanks, Celine. And I wanted to touch on some of the things that were said before, and then it's a nice bridge maybe to address your question a bit more directly. I mean, you know, we yes, we're a business, but we also know certain things, right? And so we know that diversity of content is good for member retention, and we want to retain our members because that is how, you know, Netflix makes money. It's by subscriptions, right? There's no advertising, no user-generated content. So we know that by proposing a diverse slate of content to our members, that convinces them month on month to subscribe again and discover what's out there, right? So even if someone really, really loves rom-coms, you know, we also think that exposing them to content from all over Europe, other genres all over the world will help us as a business. And then the other thing that we know is that people want to see themselves reflected on screen. That is also, you know, good for diversity. It's also good for our business. And, you know, we've been able, I believe, to, you know, do some titles recently which have already done that. I mean, again, just thinking about, I think, you know, Italy, which sells, you know, the Italian Black immigrant experience. We had really good feedback about that one. I think in terms of your question, maybe, you know, to frame it a little bit also, we've only been present in all 27 EU member states. It was 2016, the year, right? So we're 5 years into the adventure. We're at the beginning of the journey still, but we are year on year expanding our local content slates. And you know, we've recently again launched content in countries where, you know, we didn't necessarily have content. We just launched our first Portuguese original show called Gloria, which I'm very excited about. And you know, just 2 years ago, that would not have necessarily been on the card. So I think as we also grow our you know, risk taste is you know, growing. We're working with more and more people, and we definitely, I think, you know, you were mentioning small producers. I think, you know, as long as the production value is there, because you also mentioned, you know, consumers want great production value. They want really, really great products. If we can avoid doing one size fits all by working with a more diverse pool of producers and talent, I think that will help us in the long run as a business, and it will also increase diversity.
Great. Well, look, thank you for that, Marianna. I think it's a conversation we'll take up at another time. I don't mean to cut you short, but I think we are coming very close to the end of our session. I think we'll be going back to the plenary room very, very shortly. But I would, in conclusion, like to thank all of our panelists today, Maya, Andrea, Barbara, Elia, and Marianna. Thank you all for a lively discussion. As I said, I think there's plenty of points we can take up. Hopefully, we'll find an outlet, a venue to further our discussions. I think we're only at the start of the new regulatory journey, really, in relation to the revised provisions of the directive. So hopefully we can take up some or all of these points at some later time. But thank you all very much indeed. And I think we will be exiting this room fairly shortly. Thank you.